Hello, I'm Andy Agapangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Rupert Nathan in my capacity as Chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Rupert, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me. As you know, the conversation is being video recorded, and the video recording will be placed on the APPG's website, and we'll use social media and so on to raise awareness of it. You're carrying out this conversation with me, Rupert, on the basis that you have already provided a written submission to the APPG's call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. So, Rupert, first question, if I may, could I invite you to briefly introduce yourself and outline, just briefly to begin with, how you first came to interact with the FCA? Thank you.
Sure. My name is Rupert Nathan, and in mid-2016, I was very surprised to be summoned to a significant influence function interview with the FCA, following an application that was made by my new employer, Golden Way Global Investments, for approval to perform controlled functions. The FCA had previously approved me for these roles on at least two other occasions. And at the time, I'd actually worked in the industry for more than 30 years and had an unblemished record. The FCA had claimed on several occasions the interview was actually routine and there was no other reason for it. But I was to learn much later, including from sources within the FCA, that this was untrue. The real reason was that my previous employer, Fortrade, had made some malicious allegations about me to the FCA. I was not surprised to hear this because I actually had serious concerns regarding the honesty and integrity of the new CEO, who was appointed in April 2015 following the hasty removal of his predecessor. Our working relationship was problematic, and this led to my departure May the following year. The FCA never brought these accusations to my attention, nor was I offered the opportunity to address them. Even more strange was that they didn't even bother to seek my assistance with their investigation into Fortrade, especially after Fortrade had apparently lawyered up and the FCA backed off. As far as I'm aware, they took no further action other than my subsequently being used as convenient scapegoat for them both. But this is classic FCA modus operandi. Last year, I submitted a Freedom of Information and GDPR request to both the FCA and Fortrade in an effort to discover the truth. With the help of my MP, the FCA reluctantly released some heavily redacted documents. Fortrade, on the other hand, initially ignored the request and even denied any discussion with the FCA. This is something that FCA documents actually clearly contradict. Despite receiving a direction from the Information Commissioner, Fortrade still has yet to respond. At the end of the SIF interview last July, I asked specifically if I was there because of something about my character. Two of the panel members gave very evasive answers, but made absolutely no reference to any allegations. This is contradicted by an internal FCA briefing note for the interview panel. They would have both doubtless seen these and read these beforehand. And it clearly stated that supervision had an open case looking at AML failings at Fortrade and expressing a concern that I lacked the required competence and capabilities. Another internal email from the FCA I saw was headed Fortrade Limited AML weaknesses. Again, that clearly states that because of failings identified at Fortrade, they had decided to proceed with the SIF interview. After the rejection of the application, my appeal to the Regulatory Disputes Committee referred to the prejudicial comments of the SIF panel's concerns over the AML function of Fortrade arising from their review of the function were highlighted. I pointed out that none of these had been properly disclosed and I was not given an opportunity to address them. Incredibly, the FCA responded there was no basis whatsoever about these concerns regarding Fortrade and any potential failings being taken into account. But this again is contradicted by documents I obtained from the FCA, as well as a closing remark in their response where they say, I quote, "The second interview panel was aware that none of the concerns about for trade were to be considered in forming their view of Mr. Nathan's fitness and propriety." The FCA's position was disingenuous. Not only were the alleged concerns and for trade allegations well known to them, they were the real reason for the SIF interview. The SIF interview was not merely routine as consistently claimed. They clearly lied and withheld information about me. And I believe that the outcome had already been decided before the interview, which was in effect a kangaroo court.
Rupert, thank you. Could you please outline what your, excuse me, what is your interest in or connection with the FCA now?
Well, my interest as someone in the financial services industry is, I think quite obvious, given that they are the regulator. And in a broader context, I have an interest as a member of the public and someone who I actually do believe in the stated principles of the FCA to look after the interests of consumers and to have a fair and equitable banking sector.
Thank you, Rupert. And briefly describe the interactions you personally had with the FCA.
I had many interactions over several years. I guess two actually stand out. In 2002, I supplied evidence of serious misconduct by a previous employer, Hoodless Brennan, who later became Beaufort Securities, which was apparently not acted upon. When I inquired about this the following year, the FSA was dismissive. Beaufort Securities was subsequently placed in administration 2018, shortly after the US Justice Department brought criminal charges against them for its alleged involvement in securities fraud and money laundering. In 2003, I notified them that the FSA register incorrectly showed a position with Raymond James that I'd actually never taken up. They refused to remove it. And during the SIF interview process, the FCA incorrectly stated in evidence with a negative inference on my character that I held this investment advisor function for only 5 days.
In broad terms, Rupert, what have your dealings with the FCA been like?
In general, have varied from unhelpful to officious and secretive. The SIF interview in particular, the FCA has been quite malicious and vindictive.
Have you ever witnessed any actions or conduct that, in your personal reasonable belief, breached any law, regulatory code or applicable or relevant policy? If so, please tell us about that.
Yeah, above all, I've been denied due process and natural justice through willful and deliberate suppression of information to the extent of lying. I believe the unproved charges made by For Trade has led the FCA to secretly blacklist me. The FCA has abused its powers and process by calling me for a SIF interview under false pretenses in order to ban me, ignoring the RDC's binding decision that I was fit and proper to act as a director within a few weeks, and deliberately discouraging and obstructing the director application. The unnecessary release of a decision notice, which is actually contrary to guidance in the FCA Handbook Enforcement Guide 6.2.17 on the spurious pretext of public interest, and their cynical abuse of GDPR and FOI disclosure requirements to cover its tracks. Overall, the FCA has fallen well short of its own code of conduct that it applies to firms it regulates, and at a very minimum has not acted with integrity or openness.
Thank you again, Rupert. Question number 6, Rupert. Have you experienced situations where interacting with the FCA has been helpful to either yourself or others? And if so, please tell us about that.
I'm afraid I can't.
Question number 7. What are your thoughts on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't apply or make good use of the powers that it already has?
Now, I think the FCA already has considerable powers, but it appears to use these very selectively and inconsistently. In my case, it wasted a disproportionate amount of time and resources on something really quite minor, whereas far more important matters such as, say, Woodford or London Capital Finance are allowed to drag on and or go nowhere.
Number 8, have you experienced any difficulties or shortcomings in your interactions with the FCA?
Yes, frequently. They've been fraught and they're really quite difficult.
Number 9, have you experienced the FCA being reluctant to give clear answers to your questions?
Often. In my experience, the FCA has shown itself to be adept at deflection, obfuscation, and even lying. The FCA's primary objective appears to be self-preservation or justification of its existence.
Question number 10, Rupert. What is your perception of the culture of the FCA? What do you think about its culture?
I think it's toxic. It's a matter of do as we say, not as we do. They seem to believe that they are above the law. The same rules that they expect from those they regulate simply don't apply to them. I mean, an example is of one of the panelists of my first SIF interview, Gunnar Burkhardt. His LinkedIn profile brazenly lists his current positions as a senior FCA advisor, as well as a senior position within an FCA regulated firm. I mean, why is this allowed? Surely that has huge potential for a conflict of interests. I also sense a kind of bunker mentality or obsession with secrecy and self-protection, especially their senior executives. I mean, the FCA, especially under Andrew Bailey, has been characterised by negligence, incompetence and indifference to the needs of ordinary depositors and investors. And incredibly, this guy now heads up the Bank of England.
Next question, Rupert, number 11. Have you ever complained officially about the FCA? If so, tell us about that.
I did actually threaten to make a formal complaint relating to the obstruction of the Icon Finance CF1 application I mentioned earlier in defiance of the RDC decision. They didn't seem to be all that concerned by it. At the end of the day, Icon's lawyers advised against doing so, feeling that there was too much to lose by upsetting the FCA. But I've recently lodged a formal complaint concerning this whole SIF interview and hoping to clear my name and to obtain redress. Although, frankly, I'm not that confident.
Rupert, thank you. What do you think about the possibility of conflict of interest issues at the FCA?
I don't think it's a possibility, it's a definite probability. The FCA is too close to city interests, notably via the revolving door. This is at the expense of the interests of the ordinary consumer the FCA claims it aims to protect. Despite its enormous powers, no senior banker has been brought to account, especially after the GFC. Instead, either less senior staff have made scapegoats, as I was, or firms given large fines, which are ultimately borne by the shareholders. Yet the FCA will trumpet these as successes. I think given the city's critical importance to the economy, the elephant in the room is a clear and present danger of a convergence of both political capture and regulatory capture. The obvious example being David Cameron's long-standing relationship with Greensill and the FCA's continued inactivity on the matter, despite saying potentially criminal allegations have been made about the circumstance of this firm's failure.
Do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the spot checks carried out by VAT inspectors? Yes,
I do.
What positives are there, Rupert, about the FCA that you'd like to comment on?
I'd struggle to find any. I have over the years heard of some laudable ideas, but they seem to go nowhere. I think there are serious conflicts within the FCA.
Thank you. If you could change 3 things about the FCA, Rupert, what would they be?
Firstly, I'd go for far greater accountability and transparency. Second, I would firmly close the revolving door. And thirdly, I'd remove staff bonuses.
Question number 16, Rupert. The FCA is undertaking a transformation project. Do you have any comments to make about that?
Well, the FCA is demonstrably incapable of any meaningful change. You just have to look at the rebranding from the FSA to the FCA following the abject failure of its fabled light touch regulation leading up to the GFC. Nothing's changed. Instead, it's presided over a series of errors. It failed to investigate whistleblower complaints against HBOS. It refused to publish its own report into the RBS Global Restructuring Group in full. It failed to respond to warnings about London Capital Finance and also Woodford. This has cost consumers money. Any transformation of the FCA must not come from within. It should come from outside and should start from the top down.
The final question, Rupert. Are there any other comments that you'd like to make?
I guess what just in summary, that based on unsubstantiated and still unknown serious allegations made by Full Trade, the FCA has spent disproportionate time and effort pursuing what appears to have been a hidden agenda to make an example of me. Rather than fully investigate the serious compliance and AML failings of Full Trade, it seems the FCA chose to take the easy way out and make me the scapegoat. This is standard FCA practice from what I've seen. I was summoned to a biased SIF interview under false pretenses that produced a predictable outcome. And even after the RDC partially upheld my appeal, ruling I was fit and proper to act as director, the FCA ignored this binding decision within a matter of weeks and deliberately discouraged and obstructed a subsequent application for me to be a CF1 director. I was not found guilty of misconduct of any kind. Instead, this is a relatively minor supervisory action relating to particular facts at a specific firm with no wider implications arising from it. Despite this, the FCA nevertheless insisted on the unnecessary release of a detailed and one-sided decision notice on the spurious pretext of public interest. This particular action alone has caused considerable and irreparable professional and personal reputational damage and financial loss to me. Had the FCA agreed to Golden Way's early proposal to amend the application to director only without the compliance role, as the RDC ultimately ruled, I would not have suffered the negative publicity or the professional and financial damage I have since. But the FCA flatly refused, choosing to adopt a very hard and ruthless tack. Contrast the FCA's spite toward me with Andrew Bailey's excuse for not releasing the RBS report by claiming such reports were not intended for public view, as individuals had not had the opportunity to see or comment on adverse comments about them. I'll rest my case.
Rupert Nathan, thank you very much indeed. As you know, your video recording will be placed onto the APPG's website. We'll be drawing attention to it by way of social media and so on. And also your written testimony will be available for people to download if they choose to from the website as well. So Rupert, thank you very much indeed for contributing to the APPG's call for evidence about the FCA. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome, Andy.